afternoon, everyone. I'm Joy Reid. This is the Reid Report. And on this Wednesday, there's renewed global pressure to rescue nearly 300 girls kidnapped in Nigeria.
It is finally time that we make something happen to make it stop.
These are crimes committed against humanity, and these crimes against humanity must stop.
You have a group of very despicable and devilish human beings who have no value for human life.
We should be clear, this is not just a Nigerian issue, it is a global issue.
It is on the world platform, and let us as a world deal with this along with Nigeria.
As the U.S. sends in people to help, we'll explain what they're up against. Plus, here we go again, another Benghazi investigation on the way.
There's not going to be a sideshow. There's not going to be a circus. This is a serious investigation.
Okay, but what if you threw a bipartisan Benghazi hearing and the Democrats didn't show up? We'll hear from the lawmaker who calls the new Republican fishing expedition a, quote, colossal waste of time. And race and politics. Two Democrats engage in some frank talk about the role race has played in the gridlock facing the country. And who they are might surprise you. But first, there are reports of renewed violence in Nigeria, even as the international push intensifies to bring home the hundreds of girls kidnapped by terrorists. Several sources are reporting that civilians were gunned down and homes torched in a brutal massacre that killed as many as 300 people on the Nigerian border with Cameroon. That attack is being blamed on Boko Haram, the same group that has claimed responsibility for the mass kidnapping on April 14th in Chibok. Elsewhere in the country, villagers fled their homes after at least another 8 girls were kidnapped this week, reportedly also by Boko Haram. As to the role of a U.S. team being sent in, the State Department had this update moments ago.
Our ambassador met with the Nigerian National Security Advisor. AFRICOM will send a team shortly to assess Nigerian needs. Our legal attaché has been in touch with Nigerian police. The FBI stands ready to send additional personnel to provide technical and investigatory assistance, including expertise on hostage negotiations.
Now, to be clear, a number of U.S. military officials have been on the ground in Nigeria since well before the girls were kidnapped as part of the military's Permanent Office of Security Cooperation there. And while the Pentagon is preparing to send in additional military to Nigeria as a formal assessment team, defense officials say no decisions have been made to deploy any combat forces. As NBC News reports, what is pretty much a certainty, according to one senior official, is that the U.S. military will deploy surveillance drones from AFRICOM in Europe to take part in overhead search operations and intelligence gathering. And as the U.S. role plays out in the coming days, members of Congress have set their sights on the leader of Boko Haram.
We have such a defiant person that he's now kidnapped more girls. Right. I mean, this is what, there is a special place in hell for somebody like him.
They have kidnapped girls this time. They were slaughtering boys before. And this is all within the context of Nigeria becoming the fastest growing economy on the continent of Africa.
To the Congresswoman's point, Nigeria's economy is also on the world stage this week as its capital city of Abuja hosts the World Economic Forum. It's an opportunity to showcase Nigeria's economic growth that's now been overshadowed both by the kidnapping and violence and the country's pervasive poverty. Poverty that Secretary John Kerry pointed out today could drive young people to the kind of sectarianism and extremist ideologies exemplified by Boko Haram.
We see with what is happening in Nigeria with Boko Haram, the extents to which this can disrupt the world. For all of us, the truth is it's not something far away. Every American needs to understand that this is related to security at home.
And pushing for further security, all 20 female U.S. senators have sent a letter to President Obama saying, quote, "We urge you to press for the addition of Boko Haram and another militant group, the Ansaru, to the United Nations Security Council's al-Qaeda sanctions list." But as religious leaders gathered in the nation's capital in the last hour to pray for the missing girls, questions remain about how a collaboration between the U.S. and Nigeria will work. And for more on the situation in Nigeria, I want to bring in writer and Huffington Post contributor Lola Adesoye, who joins us on the phone, and Kevin Marungi, a human rights and foreign policy specialist with the youth organization Global Kids. And Kevin, I want to start with you because I think that the story here today is about the U.S. cooperation, the U.S. sort of coming in and sort of bringing in, I guess what you'd call sort of the big security guns, coming in with drones, coming in with additional help, military, not military aid, but sending in members of the U.S. military. But the thing that, to me, makes this story so poignant, and the reason that, in my opinion, it's become belatedly such a big international story, is the actual plight of these girls and the issue of human trafficking. I mean, as horrific as it is, what are these girls facing? It has been almost 30 days.
As you mentioned, it is finally the world is paying attention, and it has been over 3 weeks, and we're facing a situation with 223 girls still in captivity in a forested area, a difficult terrain to actually have a rescue effort be effective. And now we are in a situation where there's a porous border with Cameroon, and nobody's quite sure if these girls are even still in Borno State, in the northeast of Nigeria. They could have been smuggled across the border. Abubakar Shekau said very poignantly that he was going to sell these women in the open market. Yeah. The fear is that has already begun to happen.
And he openly said that slavery is allowed in his region. He believes in it. He's going to sell these girls into slavery in a situation where you're dealing with human traffickers. Once, let's say that has happened to some of these girls, and there's been this horrific, it's almost unthinkable to even talk about it, but once, let's say they have sold some of these girls, and the stories are for as little as $12 in U.S., right. How can they be found at that point?
I think now it's going to take concerted effort between all these nations that are offering support. France, Britain, the U.S. offering technical assistance, because it's become a wider issue. You're talking about Boko Haram, you're talking about their affiliation with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, you're talking about extremist groups in Cameroon and in Mali. This has become a wider regional issue, and the involvement needs to be robust and immediate to get these girls back.
And Lola, just going and taking a step back, we talked a little bit about the poverty and sort of the irony that you do have the capital of Nigeria hosting this World Economic Forum, but there is pervasive poverty. But the other issue I'd like you to talk about is this also issue of anti-colonialism. We've all been sort of shorthanding Boko Haram's name to mean books are haram, books are forbidden, but really it's more complicated than that. There's a scholar from the University of Indiana who said that really it isn't Western education is forbidden, it's more of a broader colonial term and a reaction against the fact that colonialists, when they were occupying and sort of running that country, forbade the traditional religions, forbade the traditional teaching, which was Islamic teaching, and that Boko Haram is in a lot of ways a reaction to that and to Westernism itself. How has that aspect and poverty played into kind of the growth of groups like Boko Haram?
To be honest, I wouldn't, with all due respect to that person, I don't necessarily believe that. Just because if you look at certain parts of Nigeria, like the South, for example, you have educated people who are Christian, who are Muslim. It's not really about colonialism. I think in that particular region of Nigeria, there's a lot of poverty. It's one of the poorest areas in Nigeria. There's about 3 times the amount of poverty that there is in the northeast than there is in the south. I think that Boko Haram has emerged from a mixture of political and social and economic conditions that have given rise to a group of men who feel emasculated, who feel disaffected, who feel disenchanted. Plus, they also have their own way of leading, which is somewhat different from the rest of the country that's connected to the government. So I wouldn't say it's colonialism, but I would say it is a mixture of social and political issues that basically have left a void for these people to emerge.
And Lola, what they want is to take over the government and install sort of a Taliban-like Islamic government in Nigeria. It does puzzle, I think, a lot of people who look at this, that the Nigerian government hasn't more robustly tried to deal with this group and this insurgency before. Not only that, and the fact that they've taken so long to deal with this issue with the girls.
Yeah, I mean, one of the issues is just general ineptitude of the government. I'm sorry, I just have to say it like that. We're not talking an American government that, you know, reacts to things and gets on it and gets a press secretary. We're talking a government that's kind of slow and doesn't necessarily, even within its own country, understand what's going on. Nigeria is a huge population. It is the most populous country in Africa. We're talking millions and millions of people. I mean, it's huge. I think before, the government thought that Boko Haram is a northeastern problem. It's not really going to affect everywhere else, and so you can just ignore it, and, you know, it's just a few guys causing trouble.
Yeah, and then
yeah,
and clearly that's not true. And Kevin, is it possible to use the fact that Nigeria is trying to put itself on display as sort of a growing economy, and this is a giant, you know, sort of, it pokes a giant hole in this notion of Nigeria as this modernizing country when this can take place within it? Is it possible to use this moment on the world stage to sort of force the government of Nigeria to do more to help these girls?
I think it is possible, and it's what needs to happen. We've seen now globally people have been galvanized to make sure that something is done to rescue these young women. And President Goodluck Jonathan has to actually take decisive action. Now, we've seen, and I agree with what Lola said, this is an issue of a marginalized North, historically marginalized, impoverished, people who are jobless. So they need to address this issue, the Nigerian government, on several different fronts. There's a security, military assessment to get the girls back, and then there's a political and economic assessment to address those years of marginalization, to address the corruption that has led to people feeling disaffected in this way, and thus being easier to recruit to some of these more extremist causes.
Yeah, indeed. Human rights activist Kevin Murungi from Global Kids, Inc., as well as Lola Adesoye, thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
All right, and up next, the Democratic congressman leading the charge to boycott John Boehner's Select Committee on Benghazi.